He told her to talk to his lawyer and laughed. But the prenup he forgot about changed everything. Subscribe for more stories like this and comment below, where are you watching from? Samira Miller had long since learned the art of disappearing in plain sight. She wasn't invisible by accident. No, it had taken years of careful steps, of calculated silence, of choosing the shadows instead of the spotlight. She was a woman of immense intelligence and quiet force, but the world only ever saw her as Jason Miller's wife, and that title became both her mask and her prison. She allowed it. She nurtured it. She endured it. And for a time, she even believed it was enough. Born and raised in Atlanta, Samira had always stood out, not for her skin, though in certain boardrooms that had been its own challenge, but for her mind. She held 2 degrees from MIT, one in civil engineering and the other in legal studies, both earned before her 30th birthday. She had been one of the most sought-after legal consultants in the startup space, known for her uncanny ability to translate brilliant but chaotic technical visions into clean, enforceable contracts that protected both ideas and people. It was at a business conference in San Jose, a crowded, buzzing affair filled with overconfident tech bros and exhausted venture capitalists, that she first met Jason Miller. He had been standing awkwardly near the edge of a networking cocktail hour, holding a wrinkled manila folder full of architectural sketches and nervously pitching them to anyone who would listen. His suit didn't fit quite right, and he didn't have a team or a product, just vision and charisma, and enough charm to keep the conversation going. She'd overheard his elevator pitch from a few feet away, and was intrigued not by the idea, most of them were the same, but by the passion in his voice when he spoke about space, structure, and design that breathes with the people who live inside it. They started talking over coffee in the hotel lounge that same night. Jason had energy, no doubt. He was ambitious, desperate to build something real, but he was a mess, legally, structurally, financially. What Samira saw in him wasn't a partner, not yet. What she saw was a puzzle to solve. She offered to look over his documents. That was how it began. Over the next few months, she helped him build a legitimate corporate foundation from the ground up. She structured his business entity, secured IP protections, and drafted his first client contracts. When he needed a simple web-based interface to show how his modular housing concept could adapt to climate fluctuations, she coded the prototype herself. Her legal background allowed her to navigate zoning loopholes in early projects. Her engineering degree helped him win his first city bid by designing a load distribution algorithm that no one else could match. She was not his employee. She was not a silent partner. She was the co-architect of everything. And yet, as they grew closer, late nights drafting proposals, early mornings visiting build sites, Jason's natural charisma took center stage. Investors looked at him, clients listened to him. He told stories of his company with such conviction that even Samira, watching from the corner of conference rooms, sometimes forgot she was the one who had built the scaffolding. They started dating officially 6 months after that first meeting. A year later, he proposed with a quiet picnic in Sausalito overlooking the bay. Samira, for all her sharp logic and unshakable realism, had been caught off guard. She loved him, genuinely. She loved his fire, his unpredictability, the way he made her laugh in the middle of deadlines. But most of all, she loved who she was when she was with him, useful, brilliant, essential. She said yes. Before the wedding, she insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Jason blinked in surprise at first, but didn't resist. "You're the lawyer," he'd said with a shrug. "Do whatever makes you feel secure." She drafted the document herself with surgical precision. It was not cruel or suspicious, just fair. The key clause buried in the 8th paragraph of the second section stated that in the event of infidelity or moral breach, language chosen carefully, the injured party would receive 50% of all marital assets, including any business entities founded during the marriage. Additionally, it required that any intellectual contributions from either spouse be formally disclosed and acknowledged during a legal dissolution. Jason signed without reading closely. He was in love. He trusted her, and he believed, in his arrogance, that he would never give her a reason to invoke it. Their wedding was small and tasteful, held on the cliffs of Big Sur. Photos from that day would later appear in magazines when Jason's company, eventually named Arcuspace, landed its first 8-figure contract. But in those photos, Samira was barely visible, always at the edge of the frame, smiling with quiet pride. The first few years of marriage were a blur of long hours, growing pains, and minor triumphs. Jason's name started circulating in architectural forums. A revolutionary new project management system that allowed clients to visualize airflow and sunlight in real time became Arcuspace's signature, built on the platform Samira had mocked up in a weekend. She refused to patent it in her name. "We're a team," she'd said when he asked. "It's all one house." But slowly, imperceptibly, things began to shift. Jason started traveling more, often without her. Meetings were suddenly too high stakes, or not your scene. Samira transitioned into a full-time advisor, then into an informal role entirely. At first, she didn't mind. She believed in their work, in him. But after the 5th press article failed to mention her at all, after the company's Wikipedia page labeled her only as Jason's spouse, something began to wither. She brought it up once. He laughed. "You want credit now?" he said, brushing her off with a kiss on the cheek. "Don't worry, babe. Everyone who matters knows how important you are." But the calls stopped coming. The projects moved forward without her. He'd send her photos from hotel balconies in Dubai, Paris, Sao Paulo, always alone, always smiling. She told herself it was fine, that she didn't need the spotlight, that behind every great man stood a greater woman. But she couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation that she had become an afterthought in the empire she had helped construct. Years passed. The house in Pacific Heights was beautiful but cold. Their dinner conversations shrank to logistics. Jason was rarely home for long. She spent her days managing the household staff, responding to distant family with vague pleasantries, and tinkering with old designs she would never build. Then came the laughter. Not hers, Jason's. It was a Tuesday evening, the fog rolling in over the bay, when he walked in late, still in a pressed shirt from whatever panel he had spoken on. She had waited with dinner, not out of habit, but because she had questions. Instead, he placed his briefcase on the table, loosened his collar, and said it with a smirk. "I'm filing for divorce." He didn't say it with cruelty or even anger. He said it like he was telling her the weather. "Talk to my lawyer. He'll walk you through the numbers." Samira stared at him for a moment, her heart thudding in her chest, not from heartbreak, but from the deafening silence that followed. Jason continued, completely unaware of the gravity of what he had said. He poured himself a drink, humming under his breath as if he had just crossed something mundane off his to-do list. She didn't respond. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood up, walked to the cabinet near the study, opened a locked drawer, and pulled out a folder she hadn't touched in nearly a decade. Inside was the original prenup, signed by both of them, notarized and sealed. She unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases with her fingers, and read the words she had written herself so many years ago. Her lips didn't move. Her expression didn't change. But her heart slowed, and something inside her realigned. Jason had no idea what he had just started. And Samira, for the first time in a very long time, felt entirely, brilliantly awake. The silence in the Miller house after Jason's announcement stretched like a taut wire, humming with a frequency only Samira could hear. For days, he acted as if nothing unusual had occurred. He came and went at irregular hours, still smiling into his phone on video calls, still posing for quick photos in the driveway when reporters caught him leaving for work. It was as if he had fired a bullet into their marriage and walked away without looking back, assuming the silence meant he hadn't missed. Samira, however, was not wounded. Not yet. She was calculating, observing, breathing differently. Something inside her had shifted the moment she had read the 8th clause in the prenuptial agreement, and now every gesture of his only reinforced her purpose. Jason's schedule had become more erratic in recent months, long before the divorce announcement. It wasn't the hours that concerned her. His profession often demanded late nights and spontaneous flights, but rather the patterns that emerged behind them. Where once he'd excitedly narrate his travel plans to her, now he mumbled them between bites or typed them into his phone while ignoring her questions. Where once he brought home ideas, now he brought only the scent of unfamiliar cologne and silence. Samira had noticed the change slowly, almost imperceptibly. It began with the suits. Jason had always dressed well, but his new wardrobe looked curated, sharper, bolder, far more expensive. He claimed it was for branding. Clients expect a look, he'd said once while adjusting his cufflinks in front of the mirror. And I'm the face of innovation now. Then came the new fragrance, a musky scent that lingered in his scarves and on the car seats. Samira had asked about it once, playfully. Trying something new? He chuckled without looking up from his phone. A gift from a supplier in Milan. Then there were the business trips, New York, Dubai, Toronto, then back to San Francisco for a single night before heading off to Boston. At first, she didn't question it. Arcaspace had gone global, and expansion demanded presence, but as the weeks passed, the nature of these trips grew more ambiguous. The itinerary lacked specifics. His explanations became vague, and each time he returned he seemed a little more distracted, a little less tethered to the world they had once shared. Still, Samira said nothing. She watched. She listened. She noticed how often he mentioned the name Haley, once in passing, then more frequently, always with a casual familiarity that grated against her patience. Haley was young, blonde, and energetic, the new communications lead for Arcaspace. Samira had met her once during a holiday mixer the year prior. She'd shaken her hand and seen the glint of admiration in the girl's eyes as she hung on Jason's every word. It had seemed harmless at the time. Now, she wasn't so sure. On social media, Samira rarely posted, but she paid attention. A tagged photo from an architecture summit in Miami showed Jason standing beside Haley, both of them smiling too broadly for a strictly professional relationship. Another photo, shared by one of Arcaspace's junior partners, caught Jason and Haley seated too closely at a restaurant, his hand resting casually on the back of her chair. The captions were innocent, but the expressions were not. He hadn't even tried to hide it. Samira found herself studying those images late into the night, not with jealousy, but with curiosity. Jason had become a caricature of the man she once knew, still charming, still persuasive, but hollow. His ambition had grown teeth, and it devoured everything in its path. including her. One evening, about 2 weeks after his casual declaration of divorce, he returned home late again. Samira had prepared dinner, out of habit more than desire, and waited for him, not at the table, but in the shadows of the living room. He walked in with a leather duffel bag slung over his shoulder, whistling softly. When he spotted her in the dim light, he blinked, surprised but not bothered. "You're up," he said, slipping off his coat and hanging it by the door. "I figured you'd be asleep." Samira stood slowly. "We need to talk." Jason paused, sighed, and forced a smile as if indulging a child. "Sam, I'm exhausted. Can we not do this tonight?" She didn't flinch. "Then when?" He rubbed his forehead, setting his bag down. "We've already discussed this. You'll get everything you're entitled to. My lawyer—" "I'm not interested in what your lawyer thinks," she interrupted quietly. "I want to hear it from you." Jason stared at her, eyes narrowing slightly. "What is this, Samira? Some dramatic scene? You always knew this wouldn't last forever." That sentence, so casually delivered, so cutting, landed harder than she'd expected. She let it sink in, not because she needed the pain, but because she wanted to remember it. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady. He shrugged. "Because we're not the same people we were. I've grown. You've stagnated. You don't come to events. You're not involved with the company. You don't even understand the pressure I'm under. And frankly, the fire's gone. We've become roommates." Samira nodded slowly, as if processing a business proposal. "And Haley?" He froze for a fraction of a second, then chuckled. "I knew you'd go there. So you're not denying it." Jason poured himself a glass of whiskey and walked past her to the window, looking out over the city skyline. "Look, it's not serious. I'm not running off with her. I need someone who makes me feel alive again." She watched his reflection in the glass, how easily he could say such things, how effortlessly he had erased their history. "You're not as attractive as you used to be, Samira," he added bluntly, swirling the drink in his hand. "And you've become controlling, always analyzing everything like it's a case file. Life isn't a courtroom." Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't let it show. Not now, not yet. "So, this is your justification?" she said quietly. He turned, eyes gleaming with confidence. "This is me being honest. I deserve to be happy. And so do you. So let's be adults. Divide what needs to be divided and move on." Samira stepped closer. 50%. Jason frowned. "What?" "You said divide. That means 50% of the company, the assets, the properties, and the patents. You signed that." He scoffed. "You're being ridiculous." "No," she said, her tone sharpening. "You're being forgetful, or arrogant, or both. But I haven't forgotten a single word of that contract." Jason's face twisted, uncertain whether to laugh or rage. "I've already hired a top firm, Samira. You don't stand a chance." For the first time in weeks, she smiled. It wasn't wide or mocking. It was quiet, controlled, measured. "We'll see." She left him standing there, still holding his drink, staring after her like she had spoken in another language. Upstairs, in the study she had once used to draft the very contract he had now forgotten, Samira sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. The files were still there. The original code from the simulation platform, her notes on structural fluidity, drafts of internal models she had contributed to but never claimed. Her name wasn't on the company website, but her fingerprints were everywhere. Jason believed the silence meant surrender, but for Samira, silence was strategy, and the storm was only beginning. The night after their last confrontation passed without sleep. Samira lay awake in the darkness of their cold, expansive bedroom, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her mind sharp and electric. The words Jason had spoken still echoed faintly in the recesses of her thoughts, careless, condescending, dismissive. But they no longer hurt. They no longer pierced like they once did. Instead, they functioned as something else entirely now. Evidence. Fuel. His arrogance had become a tool in her hands. At first light, she rose without disturbing the sheets beside her. Jason hadn't come to bed. She found him asleep on the living room sofa, one arm dangling off the edge, the untouched glass of whiskey on the table beside him. He looked peaceful there, as if the chaos he had initiated the night before no longer existed. Samira observed him for a moment, not with affection, not even with anger, but with a strange detachment. She felt nothing. Not for the man who had once been her partner, her ambition's companion, her closest confidant. The person lying there was a stranger who had worn her husband's skin. Back in her study, she moved with purpose. She retrieved the folder from the lower drawer of the filing cabinet, thick with contracts, timestamps, and backup drives, and laid it on the desk with care. Every document inside had been stored and protected for years, almost instinctively. She had not expected to use them, but part of her had always known that one day she might need them. She never anticipated betrayal, but she always believed in preparedness. She began with the contract. The prenup had aged well, printed on legal parchment, signed and dated, and notarized in duplicate. Her own signature was fluid and confident, and Jason's, in comparison, was rushed, as if he had barely read it. She remembered that day clearly now, the sunlit afternoon before their wedding, the way she'd slid the document across the table, explaining each section in calm, professional tones. He hadn't questioned a single clause, only smiled and said, "You know, I'd never hurt you." Clause 8. That was the one. She traced her finger across the bolded line with surgical precision. In the event of confirmed infidelity or demonstrable moral misconduct leading to a request for divorce, the initiating party, herein referred to as the breaching spouse, shall be required to forfeit 50% of all jointly held and derived marital assets, including, but not limited to, real property, business shares, income-based investments, and intellectual property connected to any joint creation during the course of the marriage. Jason had called her obsessive for wanting legal clarity in their personal lives, but she had spent too many years watching women, brilliant, patient women, be discarded by the men they had built empires with, left with nothing but fading gratitude and old photographs. She had never intended to become one of them. Now she wouldn't be. She opened her laptop. The screen blinked to life, welcoming her with the quiet familiarity of a world she had once ruled. Folder after folder lined the screen, each meticulously labeled initial drafts, contract models, structural algorithms, UX sim prototypes. Each file represented hours of her labor, her thoughts, her design work, contributions that had lived behind Jason's name on every presentation. She opened one, a simulation file for Archispace's adaptive airflow model. It had been the flagship breakthrough in their early years, the one that secured their first municipal contract in Santa Clara. But, buried in the metadata, the author tag read S.A. Miller. The date preceded the formation of Archispace by 6 months. Her hands moved with quiet speed. She copied the files to a secure drive, then backed them up to a cloud vault. She labeled each document carefully, preserving date stamps and revision histories. As she worked, the shape of her strategy began to take form. Not one built on emotion or revenge, but on facts, precision, and irrefutable proof. She knew Jason. She knew his rhythm, his weaknesses. He relied on charm to carry him through mistakes. He manipulated perception, shaped narratives, turned doubt into opportunity. But what he underestimated was documentation, paper trails, authorship, and her ability to wield them like a scalpel. By mid-morning, she had compiled a 100-page dossier of her intellectual contributions to Archispace: files, emails, design sketches, legal memos. She printed them on thick stock paper, sorted them into labeled binders, and tucked them into a leather briefcase she hadn't used since her last consulting role. She knew she couldn't walk into a courtroom unprepared, and she also knew she needed an outside voice, someone with standing and professional recognition to verify her technical authorship. There was only one person she trusted for that. Professor Alan Rosenthal had been her mentor during her dual degree program, a sharp-minded academic with a keen eye for ethics and engineering. She hadn't spoken to him in nearly a decade, but when she emailed him with the subject line, "Time-sensitive legal verification," he replied within 2 hours, "Come by my office, I'll make time." The visit was like stepping into a time capsule. The engineering wing of MIT smelled exactly as it had years ago: coffee, books, old carpet, and ozone from the labs. Professor Rosenthal looked older, yes, but his eyes still held the same fire. She explained everything, not the personal betrayal, but the professional erasure. She laid the documents before him one by one and watched him as he read. "These are yours," he said after the first few designs. "I remember your project proposals. You used the same model of fluid simulation during your thesis." He signed an affidavit of verification that very day. Back in San Francisco, Samira took the next step. She reached out to Maya Fulton, a rising attorney known for her aggressive litigation style and her devotion to representing women in high-profile tech divorces. Maya's office was sleek and modern, perched on the 23rd floor of a downtown tower. Her reputation preceded her. Within 5 minutes of reviewing Samira's documentation, she looked up and said, "This is airtight." "I want to proceed quietly," Samira told her. "For now." Maya nodded. "We can initiate a strategic freeze, but eventually this will go public." Samira had expected that. She wasn't afraid of public scrutiny. What she needed first was leverage, to catch Jason before he could shift assets, to force a negotiation on her terms. "I also want media protection," she added. "When it does go public, it needs to be framed properly." "I have contacts," Maya replied. "We'll control the narrative." That night, Samira couldn't sleep again, but for a different reason. This time it wasn't anxiety, it was momentum. The hum of the city outside her window felt aligned with her pulse. She stared at the ceiling not in despair, but in preparation. The machine she had helped build was now turning on its master, and she would be the one guiding its gears. By the end of the week, Maya had filed an official legal notice to Archispace requesting an audit of all intellectual contributions from founding members. It was couched in neutral language, standard protocol, nothing threatening. But the notice hit Jason's inbox like a detonation. He responded with a short, clipped message. "What the hell is this?" Samira didn't answer. The following day, she received a call from an unfamiliar number. When she picked up, the voice on the other end was shaky and uncertain. "Samira, it's Miles, Jason's attorney." She said nothing. "I think we should talk." She smiled faintly, lowering her voice. "Then talk to my lawyer." She hung up. Jason had told her to speak to his lawyer. Now it was his turn. And she wasn't just talking. She was preparing to win. The letterhead on the official notice to Archispace was pristine. Thick ivory paper embossed with gold. The legal stamp of Maya Fulton's firm subtly pressed into the corner like a signature of inevitability. It was not a threat, not formally. It was a preliminary inquiry, requesting documentation of all intellectual contributions made during the foundational years of the company. It cited clauses from internal corporate bylaws, the prenup agreement between Jason and Samira, and legal precedent from two similar cases in California that had both ended unfavorably for the founders who underestimated the authorship claims of their silent partners. Jason received it on a Wednesday morning. According to Maya's paralegal, his reply came within 30 minutes and contained only 4 words. "What the hell is this?" Samira received a copy of that reply from Maya, along with a one-line summary. "We have his full attention." She didn't smile, she didn't celebrate. This wasn't the finish line. It was only the spark. The real burn would happen behind doors he assumed were sealed. Later that day, Jason called from an unlisted number. Samira watched the screen vibrate twice, then stopped. No message, no voicemail. 10 minutes later, her inbox pinged with an email marked urgent. It was from Miles Denton, Jason's lead attorney, an overly slick corporate man known more for tax strategy than for crisis management. His message was terse and offensive, filled with thinly veiled threats about confidentiality and good faith, ending with an offer to meet informally to discuss Samira's claims. Maya advised immediate decline. "He's trying to assess your hand before we file anything publicly," she said as they sat across from one another in her office, San Francisco's skyline stretching out behind them. "But let's give him what he wants, just not what he expects." The meeting was set for Friday. It was to be held at a discreet private conference suite at a boutique hotel in the Mission District. No branding, no press. Just Samira, Maya, and a stunned man about to realize how thoroughly he had underestimated the woman he once told to talk to his lawyer. Jason didn't show up himself. That would have been too direct, too vulnerable. He sent Miles, who arrived precisely on time in a 3-piece navy suit, briefcase in one hand, an unnecessary confidence in the other. He smiled as if greeting an old friend, extended his hand, and addressed Samira in the patronizing tone that so many had used on her over the years. She didn't take his hand. She simply nodded and gestured for him to sit. Maya began the meeting with formalities. "We're not here to negotiate," she said calmly. "We're here to ensure that your client understands the gravity of the situation before we proceed." Miles chuckled. "With all due respect, Miss Fulton, we find this entire direction somewhat speculative. Jason has built Archispace with his own hands over the past decade. Any claims of outside authorship, especially from a spouse, carry considerable scrutiny." Samira opened the leather portfolio she had brought and placed it on the table. With quiet deliberation, she took out the printed stack of documents. 112 pages, indexed and tabbed. She handed them to Miles without a word. He began to read. Slowly at first, then more rapidly. Then his brow furrowed. Maya leaned back, giving him space. "These documents," he murmured, "contain internal modeling code." "Correct," Samira replied, "authored by me, before Archispace was incorporated." He kept flipping. More sketches, emails, simulation files, contracts with her signature, preceding any formal employment. There was a notarized statement from Professor Rosenthal, a patent application draft with her initials embedded in the metadata. She had signed it away voluntarily at the time because she believed in the shared vision, because she had been his partner in every way that mattered. Now, that trust had become the rope he had used to hang himself. Miles cleared his throat. I assume you have copies?" "Multiple," Maya said. "Encrypted, filed, backed up on 2 continents. Shall we continue?" The next file was the prenuptial agreement. Maya turned to the bookmarked clause. Miles scanned it once, then again. He took out his own phone, no doubt checking the date of signature and official filing. His silence deepened. "This clause," he said, "is unusually specific." "Because she wrote it," Maya replied. "You'll notice the language mirrors state precedent on intellectual contribution during marriage. Miss Miller was a practicing consultant at the time. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was anticipating reality." Miles looked at Samira for the first time with real recognition, not as a scorned wife, not as an angry woman, but as a strategist, a professional, a threat. "This isn't just a divorce proceeding," he said carefully. "It's an asset war." "No," Samira said softly. "It's a correction." The meeting concluded with polite tension. Miles promised to speak with Jason. Maya gave him 48 hours to respond with a formal offer. If none arrived, they would proceed with a full suit. One that would include demands for dissolution of asset holdings, authorship recognition, and compensation for revenue earned from her contributions. Maya also hinted that a media inquiry was pending, and they were prepared to confirm her involvement with the core Arcuspace platform when asked. That evening, Jason broke his silence. He texted Samira at nearly midnight. "Can we talk?" She didn't reply. Instead, Maya forwarded her a copy of the PR release they had prepared in case the case went public. The headline was simple and clean. Co-founders' intellectual property at center of Arcuspace legal battle. They hadn't released it yet, but Jason would know it existed. The next day, word began to spread. Subtle at first. Within the tight-knit circles of venture capital and architecture forums, people began whispering. Someone had filed for audit. Arcuspace might not be as clean as it looked. Investors sent inquiries. Board members demanded clarification. Jason tried to stay ahead of the spin, but it was already too late. His silence read like guilt, and the only person who could clarify anything was the woman he had publicly ignored for years. Within 72 hours, the first media contact reached out. A mid-tier tech columnist with good instincts had received a tip from someone in the city's legal community. They wanted a statement. Maya advised against immediate comment, let Jason scramble first, but Samira agreed to one condition. If Jason or his team went to the press, they would release everything. Names, dates, proof. By the end of the week, Jason's second legal firm quietly stepped back from representation. The senior partner had reviewed the prenuptial clause and decided it was a liability. Jason was forced to bring in a crisis manager, an expensive woman from New York who specialized in salvaging reputations. Her fee was astronomical. Her advice was simple. Settle before the story becomes public. Jason, for all his ego, finally realized he was bleeding in the water. The sharks weren't circling. They were already taking bites. He sent a final message to Samira. "Please, let's resolve this privately. What do you want?" She stared at that message for a long time before forwarding it to Maya. Later that evening, Samira sat alone in her study, the windows open to the wind rolling off the bay. The briefcase still rested on the floor beside her desk. She didn't feel triumphant. Not exactly. What she felt was more profound, a return to self, a clarity she hadn't tasted in years. The silence in the house no longer felt oppressive. It felt earned. Jason had built an empire of glass and mirrors. She had been the architect, and now she was reclaiming her signature. The courtroom was smaller than Samira expected. She had imagined, perhaps, something grander. Lofted ceilings, a dramatic oak bench, the kind of space where truth could echo with gravity. Instead, the family court chamber assigned to their case was modest, utilitarian, lined with dull carpeting and cheap wood paneling, like so many government buildings designed to contain human drama without acknowledging it. Still, it suited her purposes. The truth didn't need a stage. It needed only the weight of evidence and a voice that refused to tremble. It had been 3 weeks since Jason's final message. Since then, his tone had shifted from casual arrogance to tightly controlled desperation. He had tried every trick: off-the-record negotiations, veiled threats through proxy lawyers, private settlement offers designed to lure her into silence. He had underestimated not only the strength of her case, but the immovability of her resolve. His final offer had included a payout, a non-disclosure clause, and a carefully worded public relations script where he acknowledged her early involvement in the founding of Arcaspace. He had even offered to call her a creative advisor. Samira rejected all of it with a single word: no. Jason had signed that prenup with a smile, convinced it would never matter. Now it was the cornerstone of her case, and there was no script in the world that could rewrite it. On the morning of the hearing, Samira dressed with the same attention to detail she had once given to preparing legal exhibits. Her suit was charcoal gray, tailored with surgical precision. Her hair was pinned in a smooth twist. Her makeup was understated, flawless. She wasn't dressing to impress. She was dressing like the professional Jason had erased in every press photo of his so-called solo success. She stood before the mirror for a long moment, then slid the thumb drive with her evidence into her leather briefcase, the same one she had used during her last consulting role a decade ago. She closed the latch and exhaled slowly. Today, she would speak not as his wife, but as the woman who built the foundation beneath his empire. Jason arrived with his new attorney, a former federal prosecutor named Alan Vexler, known for his aggressive litigation style and icy demeanor. He was well prepared, polished, and deeply uncomfortable with the facts of the case he had been handed. Jason followed behind him, his usual confident gait slowed by the weight of bad optics and worse evidence. His hair was slightly disheveled, and the circles beneath his eyes hinted at more than a few sleepless nights. When his gaze met Samira's across the courtroom, he didn't smirk or nod. He just looked away. Maya sat beside Samira, calm and unshakable, her binder open, every tab marked. They didn't exchange many words. None were needed. Everything had already been said. Everything had been prepared. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with steel-gray hair and a no-nonsense voice. Her nameplate read Honorable Meredith O'Hara. As she called the case to order, there was no drama, no gasps from the gallery, just the soft rustle of legal documents and the shuffling of chairs. But Samira felt the air shift. This was no longer a marriage unraveling. It was an empire being audited. Jason's team opened with a request for limited discovery, arguing that Samira's claims, though passionate, did not demonstrate formal ownership or contractual employment with Arcaspace. They attempted to frame her as a supportive spouse, minimizing her technical contributions as informal, undocumented, or merely inspired conversation. The implication was clear. She had been helpful, but not essential. Maya let them finish. Then, with the unhurried precision of someone fully in control, she introduced the prenup into evidence. She read aloud Clause 8, her voice smooth and resolute. She then submitted the timeline. The formation of Arcuspace, the dates of Samira's prototype designs, the initial modeling code, and the revenue trajectories that followed each release of the systems she had helped build. Professor Rosenthal's affidavit was introduced, along with 3 expert declarations verifying that the architectural simulations used by Arcuspace bore distinct mathematical patterns pioneered by Samira years earlier in her academic work. Jason shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his hands clasped too tightly in his lap. Then came the emails. Samira had kept every message, every digital trace of her work. Correspondence with Jason in which she outlined development strategies, drafted contract language, and described design logic in painstaking detail. Emails where Jason praised her insight, where he thanked her for solving the airflow model that won their first city bid. Messages where he called her the engine behind the dream. She watched the judge's expression change as each piece of evidence was presented, not dramatically, but unmistakably. A subtle tightening of the lips, a sharper focus in her eyes. She was no longer seeing a bitter spouse. She was seeing a co-founder. When Maya played a short clip from a video call dated 5 years earlier, where Jason described Samira as the brains behind our simulation engine, the courtroom fell silent. Jason's lawyer tried to object, claiming the clip lacked context, but the judge overruled it. "Mr. Miller," Judge O'Hara said, addressing him directly for the first time, "did you or did you not refer to the petitioner as a foundational contributor to your company's intellectual property?" Jason cleared his throat. Yes, but it was a figure of speech." "Do you make a habit of attributing critical components of your proprietary software to people who had no involvement?" Jason paused. "No, Your Honor." The judge leaned back, scribbled a note, and looked at Maya. "Proceed." By midday, the shape of the outcome was clear. Maya rested her case, confident and composed. Alan Vexler, visibly rattled, attempted to introduce last-minute testimony regarding Jason's recent financial losses, arguing that a 50% forfeiture would destabilize the company and harm innocent employees. It was a thin plea for sympathy, one that the judge met with dispassion. "When Mr. Miller signed this contract," she said, "he did so with full capacity and legal counsel available to him. Furthermore, this court finds that the petitioner's contributions were not only substantial but central to the creation and monetization of intellectual property which Mr. Miller has profited from exclusively. The clause in question is enforceable. The evidence is overwhelming." Jason closed his eyes. The judge's ruling was clear and unequivocal. Samira was awarded 50% of all joint marital assets, including real estate, company shares, and revenue derived from products developed with her input. She was also granted formal co-authorship status in the intellectual development of Arcuspace's simulation platform. Jason was given 60 days to provide full financial disclosure and execute all necessary transfers. There was no applause, no grand declaration, just the sound of a gavel tapping twice. As the courtroom emptied, Jason lingered behind, staring at the empty bench. He didn't speak to Samira. He didn't try to intercept her. Perhaps, finally, he understood that nothing he could say would undo what had been done. Outside, the sky was overcast but bright. Samira stood on the courthouse steps, inhaling deeply, the cool air sharp in her lungs. Maya joined her a moment later, her phone buzzing with media inquiries. "It's done," Maya said. Samira shook her head slightly. "No, it's beginning." They walked together to the waiting car, the leather briefcase in her hand, now light as paper. There were stories already circulating online, headlines, speculation, but the truth didn't belong to the journalists. It belonged to her. And now the world would finally know it. The transfer of assets, though legally straightforward, unfolded over several weeks like the slow unspooling of a tightly bound thread. Contracts were rewritten, deeds updated, bank accounts partitioned, and intellectual property filings amended to include Samira's name in bold, unmistakable lettering. Each notification came with a digital ping, an email, a confirmation from Maya's office. And with each one, Samira felt a weight gradually lift, not all at once, but piece by piece, like someone taking their first real breaths after surfacing from deep water. She did not gloat. She did not announce her victory in champagne-soaked celebration. The media tried to provoke her, of course. Pundits requested interviews. Journalists from business magazines reached out with flattery-laced questions. She ignored most of them. When she did respond, it was with carefully measured statements. She didn't speak of revenge, or Jason's betrayal, or the personal cost of silence. She spoke of attribution, of clarity, of the long-overdue recognition of invisible labor that too many women performed, unpaid and unacknowledged, in every industry imaginable. Quietly, and with full legal ownership, Samira formed her own holding company. It wasn't flashy. There were no press releases or photo ops. She named it Kinetic Point, a nod to the mathematical center of distributed weight, and also to the moment of transition when stored energy becomes motion. She purchased a sleek 3-story office space in the Dogpatch neighborhood, repurposing an old converted factory into a light-drenched workspace with glass walls, exposed brick, and clean architectural lines. The kind of place she used to design for others, always as a background figure. This one would be hers. The first floor was dedicated to the foundation she launched, aimed at supporting women of color in STEM fields. She called it the Atelier Fund, reclaiming the word atelier, long reserved for old-world male craftspeople, and given it a new face. The foundation awarded microgrants, offered mentorship programs, and partnered with universities to support the research of young female engineers. She personally reviewed every application in the first cycle. She read the stories of brilliant girls from Oakland, Detroit, and rural Georgia, some with GPA scores too high to believe, others with invention portfolios sketched out in torn notebooks. And in every one of them, she saw a version of herself that might have been lost had she not remembered her own worth in time. The second floor was for her consulting practice, limited by choice to a small list of clients carefully selected for vision and values, not just capital. Tech founders with more creativity than ego, urban planners who wanted clean energy solutions, not headlines, civil engineers who still knew how to use a slide rule. She didn't need the work, but she craved the design, the thinking, the feeling of building again. Only this time she didn't give away the blueprints. The top floor was private. Her office, a reading room, and a rooftop terrace with vines of jasmine climbing the railing and views of the water on clear days. She furnished it herself. Nothing extravagant, just elegance rooted in function. A walnut desk with deep drawers, an ergonomic chair upholstered in moss green fabric, a hand-thrown ceramic lamp she'd found at a crafts fair. No gold plates, no art commissioned to impress. Everything in that space reflected her, not her marriage, not Jason, not the image she had once worked so hard to protect, just her mind, her taste, her space. The day she moved in, she stood barefoot on the terrace, coffee mug in hand, As the sun came up over the bay, the city was quiet still, humming just beneath its surface. For the first time in years, there was no one waiting for her. No schedule to fill for someone else. No invisible expectations binding her movements. Just the soft clinking of wind chimes and the scent of jasmine in bloom. Maya visited that afternoon. They sat together in the reading room, flipping through the final settlement paperwork that had arrived from the court. Everything had cleared. Everything was now irrevocably hers. Maya looked up, her expression both curious and satisfied. "You did it," she said simply. Samira nodded. "We did." "What now?" Samira didn't answer right away. Instead, she closed the folder and placed it on the table with finality. Then she stood, walked over to the wide window, and stared out at the cranes along the distant waterfront. The city was still growing. So was she. "I think," she said at last, "I'm going to build something of my own. Not just a business, a legacy, but quiet, without noise." Maya smiled. "You'll do it?" The news cycles moved on, as they always did. Jason gave one televised interview, tight-lipped and scripted, where he called the divorce a deeply personal matter and claimed to respect and acknowledge the contributions of all those who helped build Arcaspace. It was the closest thing to an apology the world would get. He resigned from the CEO position soon after, citing the need for new leadership during a transitional period. Shareholders issued carefully worded statements. The board appointed an interim executive, and the company continued, slightly bruised but intact. Jason tried to reach out once more, sending a handwritten note through his former assistant. It was folded inside a blank envelope, the ink rushed, as if written at a moment of reluctant emotion. He wrote that he hadn't realized what he was throwing away, that he hoped she was happy, and that someday, perhaps, they could talk. Samira read it once, then folded it back into the envelope, placed it in her desk drawer, and never opened it again. She didn't need his words. She had her own now. Months passed. Summer shifted into fall. The leaves along the Embarcadero turned amber and gold. Her foundation funded its first cohort of scholars. A high school girl from East LA won a science fair in her name. Samira was invited to speak at conferences, to accept awards, to grace the covers of magazines that once only quoted her husband. She declined most of them. Instead, she spent her time in design meetings and mentor sessions and walking along the pier with nothing but her thoughts, and in the kind of solitude that came not from loneliness, but from self-possession. She visited her parents in Atlanta for Thanksgiving. She called her former professors just to say thank you. She started keeping a journal again, writing not about what had happened, but about what could still come. She never once looked back. In the final weeks of that year, on a cold December afternoon, she sat on the rooftop terrace of her building, wrapped in a wool coat, sketching a draft of a new environmental architecture model. The breeze rustled her notes, and for a moment she paused, listening to the distant echo of a ferry's horn over the bay. Her phone buzzed. A message from one of her scholarship recipients had come through. "I just wanted to say thank you. No one ever believed in my work before you. I hope I can make you proud." Samira read it twice, then looked out toward the horizon. The city had changed. She had changed. The silence was no longer something she endured. It was something she owned. And in that stillness she began again, under her own name, by her own design. The year that followed the finalization of the divorce moved with a strange fluidity, as though time had finally aligned itself with Samira's internal rhythm. No longer confined by the erratic beat of someone else's ambition, she began to measure her days by what she created, not by what she tolerated. There was no celebration, no revelry over Jason's downfall, only the quiet, steady momentum of a woman building something for herself. A life not defined by proximity to power, but by the ownership of it. Jason's name faded slowly from the circles where it once echoed. He stepped down from the company citing personal health reasons, though no one close to the industry believed it. Investors who had once fawned over his charisma now spoke of him with cool detachment, labeling him a cautionary tale of what happened when image eclipsed substance. He had become, to many, an embarrassing headline they were eager to forget. His photo disappeared from the Arcaspace website. His interviews ceased, and slowly the myth of his genius gave way to a narrative that was truer and far less glamorous. Samira didn't follow his decline with interest. She didn't need to. Her attention was rooted in progress. In the spring, she oversaw the completion of her foundation's mentorship facility in Oakland, a sunlit space outfitted with whiteboards, solar panels, and rows of 3D printers for prototyping. The opening was attended by dozens of young women, engineers, coders, urban planners in the making, each of them wide-eyed and eager, some nervously clutching portfolios they thought no one would care to read. Samira walked among them not as a celebrity or benefactor, but as someone who knew what it felt like to be brilliant and invisible. She read every single proposal. She asked questions. She remembered their names. In private, she continued her consulting work with precision and integrity. She took on only the projects that aligned with her values: green architecture initiatives, low-income housing optimization, community-led planning models. It wasn't the kind of work that landed on the cover of glossy magazines, but it changed lives. She had no interest in building monuments to herself. She wanted to leave systems behind, frameworks others could adapt, access, and improve. Every so often, a journalist would try to resurrect the story, the woman behind the fall of Arcaspace. Samira Miller, the quiet force who reshaped Silicon architecture. They pitched TV specials, book deals, podcasts. She declined them all. Let Jason have the noise. She had reclaimed her peace. But even peace is occasionally interrupted. It was late October when she first heard that Jason was living alone in a rental townhouse on the outskirts of Berkeley. A mutual acquaintance, someone from their early startup days, mentioned it in passing during a panel reception. He had seen Jason at a local cafe, looking thinner, more subdued. There were rumors he'd tried to launch a new firm but couldn't secure funding. Others said he was teaching part-time, hiding from his own reputation. Samira thanked the acquaintance, offered a polite nod, and excused herself. That night, she didn't think of him with anger or satisfaction, only distance. Then, in early December, she saw him. She had just finished leading a closed strategy session for a transportation equity initiative and had stepped out into the chilled air to call a driver. As she waited under the awning of a municipal building, a man across the plaza caught her eye. He was seated alone on a bench, hunched slightly against the wind, a wool coat wrapped tight around his frame. He looked older than he had any right to. His eyes were dull, unfocused, fixed on a paper coffee cup between his hands. She recognized him immediately, but it took him a moment to register her. When he did, his posture shifted. He didn't stand. He didn't call her name. He simply watched. Samira debated walking over, but there was nothing to say. Nothing that hadn't already been written in court documents and legal transfers. Nothing that would undo the years he spent erasing her work with smiles and empty praise. She gave him a nod, polite, brief, impersonal, and turned away when her car arrived. As she pulled into traffic, she glanced once in the mirror. He was still sitting there, his shoulders drawn inward, looking like a man weighed down not by circumstance, but by the consequences of his own choices. That was the last time she saw him. Winter settled in gently that year. On Christmas morning, Samira hosted her parents for brunch at her home. Her real home now, not a house that belonged to someone else's version of a marriage. They cooked together, laughed together, watched old movies. Her mother, once so worried during the early days of the separation, marveled now at the life her daughter had built. "I never knew," she whispered as they sipped tea that evening, "how strong you were, how much you gave up for him." Samira only smiled. "I didn't give it up. I just stored it for the right time." In January, she accepted an invitation to guest lecture at Stanford, delivering a talk titled Unseen Labor, Attribution and the Architecture of Power. She spoke not of her personal story, but of patterns, the systems that kept women's work undocumented, the loopholes in intellectual property law that allowed ideas to be stolen without recourse, the cultural instinct to praise the face over the force behind it. Students filled the auditorium. Some cried. All stood when she finished. One afternoon in early spring, while cleaning out old files in her office, Samira came across a photo album buried in a bottom drawer. It was one of the few relics she had kept from her marriage, not out of sentiment, but perhaps as a reminder. She flipped through the pages slowly. There were pictures of project sites, a few blurry selfies from their early startup days, images of architectural models they had once built together on a kitchen table stained with coffee and printer ink. She paused at one where Jason stood at a podium, beaming, holding a plaque engraved with his name. She remembered that day. She had written the acceptance speech he delivered. With quiet deliberation, she closed the album and slid it into a donation box. Some memories didn't need to be burned or mourned. They only needed to be released. By the time summer arrived, Samira's foundation had expanded to 2 new cities. Her consulting firm had doubled in staff, and her personal calendar included a week-long retreat in Kyoto. For the first time in over a decade, she allowed herself to plan time without purpose, to travel for wonder, not obligation. In the garden of a centuries-old temple, she sat on a wooden bench, watching koi move through still water, and wrote in her journal. She didn't write about Jason. She didn't write about arcospace or lawsuits or victory. She wrote about motion, about light, about what it meant to live in the full dimensions of her name. On her flight home, she glanced through the in-flight magazine where a profile on a rising female engineer in Ghana caught her attention. The woman credited a small grant she had received from a California foundation for allowing her to complete her degree. Samira's name was listed in the acknowledgments. She smiled and closed the magazine. Back in San Francisco, the city moved at its usual clipped pace. Trains arrived and departed. Towers rose. People rushed toward destinations. But Samira walked at her own speed now, past the place where she had once been forgotten, past the voice that once told her to be quiet, past the man who had assumed she would never rise. She never looked back. Jason stayed where he was, and she moved forward. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Watch more stories like this one right here, and share this video with someone who needs to see it.